All right, welcome everyone. Dr. Lindner here. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about muscle physiology primarily, and I'm going to break this up into a bunch of shorts so that it's a little bit easier to process and absorb this information. So to review, I know we covered this when we did tissues and we talked about the four types of tissues, one being epithelial, two being connective, three being neural, and four being muscle. When we spoke about muscle, we said muscle comes in three different flavors, right? Skeletal, cardiac, and visceral. When we talk about skeletal, let's choose blue here. When we talk about skeletal muscle, you have voluntary conscious control over contracting muscles that attach to your skeleton, right? That's the location. When we talk about cardiac, which is heart muscle, right? It's involuntary. You don't have conscious control over how many beats per minute your heart is going to contract. And then we have smooth muscle, which is also visceral muscle that we find around our organs. We find it in the uterus, we find it around the trachea, we find it around the blood vessels, and that too is also involuntary. So the only one that we have conscious voluntary control over is skeletal muscle, and it's going to move our bones, right? We know that it is striated, much like cardiac muscle is striated. So let's talk about skeletal muscle today. Now, some of its functions, we know since muscles attach to bones, when muscles contract, and when I use the word contraction, what I'm referring to is that muscles have the ability to generate tension. I think the misnomer when we think of a contraction is the muscles always shorten. That's a contraction. No, that's not entirely true. It's true, but not entirely true because muscles can generate tension when they are shortening, when they are lengthening, and when they are remaining the same length. But muscles, when they contract, when they generate tension, they can produce movement. When they contract, they can also stabilize. So we can produce movement during concentric contractions and eccentric contractions. Both concentric and eccentric are different types of contractions. One is like a shortening phase and the other is an elongation phase. But then isometric, when it contracts isometrically, it's really not generating movement, it's stabilizing. Okay? Muscles have the ability of storing substances and even mobilizing substances within the body. So one of the things that it can store is glucose. We know that glucose is this 6-carbon sugar, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a 6-carbon sugar. That is a glucose. Now, glucose, when it's stored, we call it glycogen. Anything that ends in ogen means it's inactive and it has to be activated. So glycogen is glucose that's stored, and we store it in muscles, and it can also be stored in the liver. Those are two places that glucose can be stored, muscles and liver. Now, glucose can be broken down. When we break down glucose, we call it glycolysis. Let's look at that word. Glycolysis. Right? Glyco for glucose, and then lysis means to split apart. Well, what are we splitting apart? We're taking this glucose and we're going to break this bond here and here. And when you do, what you get is 2 3-carbon sugars. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, right? You broke the bond in the middle. That's what glycolysis is. And now we don't have glucose. When you have two 3-carbon sugars, you have something called lactate or lactic acid. Okay? Just laying down some terminology and some concepts because we will be talking about glycolysis and glucose and lactic acid when we talk about muscle physiology a bit. When muscles contract, we know that when we exercise, sometimes we perspire. When muscles contract, they do generate heat. We know that happens if you go outside and it's cold, like you're in the Northeast in the winter when we have, 12 to 15 inches of snow, which we'll have in January of this year, I'm sure. Um, you shiver. Muscles shiver. They contract rapidly to generate heat. We know if someone has a fever, sometimes they feel like they have the shivers because their muscles are contracting to raise their body temperature to burn off bacteria and viruses. Some properties of muscle tissue is that they are electrically excitable. They are electrically excitable. We will talk about in a separate video something called the NMJ, which stands for the neuromuscular junction. The neuromuscular junction, the NMJ. So muscle is electrically excitable. You know that because if you've ever been to a physical therapist or you've been to a chiropractor and you've been to a physiotherapist of some sort or physiatrist, if they've ever used electric stimulation or a TENS unit, they put those pads on muscle, they turn it up, and all of a sudden your muscles are contracting involuntary, right? Your brain is not controlling that. Muscles have the ability to contract. That's contractility. When we say contractility, we mean shorten, we mean lengthen, and we also mean remaining the same length. Muscles can shorten, muscles can lengthen, and muscles can remain the same length. That's contractility. When we talk about extensibility, that's the muscle's ability to go from a shortened state to a lengthened state. That's extending, extensibility. And elasticity is the degree of flexibility and elasticity that it has before it becomes damaged. Right? When a muscle is stretched beyond its anatomical limits, it tears or it strains. Okay. Okay, when I come back in another video, we will talk about 3 different types of contractions: concentric, eccentric, and isometric.